Hello and welcome to today's episode of A Slice of Medieval. Following on from our fantastic episode with Ian Mortimer about medieval speed, which was a little different to our usual pick a subject and go into it, we thought we'd try again, this time with medieval policing. And we've actually managed to get a former serving police officer. Tom Andrews was in the police for 13 years and is now a lecturer in policing at the University of Derby. Since 2021, he's been the editor of the Journal of the Police History Society, which is published annually for members of the PHS. He is also the author of The Greatest Policeman, a biography of Captain Athelstan Popkiss, great name, Chief Constable of Nottingham, between 1930 and 1959, and The Sharp End, Murder, Violence and Knife Crime on Nottingham's Thin Blue Line. So welcome, Tom.
Hi, Sharon. Hi, Derek.
Hi.
Really happy to have you aboard. So I've got to ask, because just because you're a police officer, it doesn't mean to say you're interested in the history of policing, does it? I mean, to be honest, you've got things on your mind like arresting people and locking them up.
It's certainly busy, yeah.
So what attracted you to the history of policing?
So I think I was probably interested in the history of policing almost before I was interested in policing. I read history at university as an undergraduate, and my final year project in that was around the topic of crime, corruption and malfeasance among Victorian police officers, which was a bit of an odd topic, but it kind of appealed to me. I'd always had it in the back of my head that I probably wanted to join the police after I graduated. So it kind of came naturally from that. And after I got interested in that, I did ultimately join the police force after graduating, but the passion for history kind of never went away and broadened from there. And I joined the Police History Society as a result of that interest, and then kind of that being part of a network of like-minded individuals, I guess, sucked me down that rabbit hole. And here I am some sort of 15, 20 years later, I'm trying to underage myself, I guess. We'll go with 15 years later. I'm still passionate about the subject.
Well, we're focusing on the medieval period more than any other, but there's no police force as such in the medieval era, is there? So who kept the peace? Well, if anybody, whose job was it, if anybody had the job?
So it was quite a complicated system, and yeah, you're quite right, Derek. Policing in the UK, kind of as we know it, you could date it starting roughly to 1798 through to 1829. So 1798 saw the introduction of the Thames Marine Police, which was the first kind of professional paid police force that we see. And then 1829 famously was the foundation of the Metropolitan Police Service, and it kind of went from there. But prior to that, that's not to say that policing didn't exist in the UK, and there were extensive different forms of law enforcement. But if we go right back to the medieval period, we can see sort of right back to Saxon times, policing, as we kind of understand it, law enforcement, was undertaken by what we would now term or be familiar with as parish constables. But at the time, they were called petty constables. And they existed in the sort of Anglo-Saxon hundreds, wapentakes, those kind of areas of local collective community responsibility. And in fact, it was what basically decided whether an area was a village or a town as to whether it was large enough to have its own petty constable. And that was the delineator between a village and a town during the Anglo-Saxon times. We then obviously see the arrival of William the Conqueror coming over, sort of upending British laws or English laws, but also kind of wanting to keep some sense of community and whilst imposing his own sense of law and order on the country, still maintaining that kind of approach of that people were familiar with. So the units of sort of community and local accountability in the wapentakes in the hundreds still existed, and we saw those petty constables who were basically elected officials. They were burgesses of the town, so they had to be of certain means and eligible to vote, basically, at the time. Which wasn't obviously a universal right. It was very, very much limited to the affluent members of the community.
Mm.
And they would do it on almost a voluntary basis. I say voluntary, it was decided by the local sort of parish councils as they later became, but the local sort of decision-making authorities who would decide amongst themselves who was going to undertake this role. And it was seen as almost a privileged position in the community because these people have responsibility for law and order. And you have to remember at the time that these communities were isolated. They were very mistrusting of strangers, and so there was that kind of sense of everybody knew each other, and therefore it was quite a responsibility to be in charge of that law and order at the time. And so that kind of was how it worked on a local basis. As you got to a more sort of regional and national basis, of course, we're all familiar with the sheriffs. And that, again, is an Anglo-Saxon term. So they existed prior to William the Conqueror coming over to the UK. And the term sheriff derives from the Anglo-Saxon term scar garefa, or shire reeve. And that then, through the development of the English language and stuff, has been transformed into the term sheriff as we know it. And they were essentially accountable to the monarch. They were the king's kind of right-hand man, I guess you would say, in the local counties, but they weren't necessarily responsible for just one county. So some of them might have covered two areas. For example, the Sheriff of Nottingham is an easy example. Everybody knows the Sheriff of Nottingham from the Robin Hood legends. He wasn't just the Sheriff of Nottingham. He covered Derbyshire and Nottinghamshire, both counties. And he was responsible for implementing the king's justice. And we can say that the king's justice because realistically he'd have only been bothered with the more affluent members of the community. We're talking the barons and other kind of landed gentry, and he was responsible for making sure they paid their taxes and obviously abided by various different kinds of laws at the time, particularly sort of common law and forest law, which was the legislation that governed the king's forest around hunting and things. We also then get, confusingly, the introduction of constables. Now, we all will be familiar with constables today as the police constable, like your local Bobby, walking around. We think of the term police constable as relating to police officers. But that wasn't the case back when after William the Conqueror's arrived. And the term constable comes from the French of compte de stable, or keeper of the stable. And this was the French term for kind of the local baron or king's right-hand man that the sheriffs had been in the UK or in England previously. So William brings these idea of the constable over, but these become responsible for looking after his castles. Obviously, William is very, very well known for castle building across the country to maintain the new sort of Norman position of power, and he introduces the constables who are in charge of his castles. But at the time, they're much more focused on military matters in terms of looking after the armies and the maintenance and the safety of the castles. They will have a little bit of law enforcement responsibility in that area, but that's much more down to the sheriff, that kind of law enforcement idea. So that's how it starts in the Middle Ages, sort of with the arrival of William the Conqueror, and before that. We progress through to Magna Carta, obviously seminal piece of legislation in 1215, and we see the introduction then of this idea of some key tenets of legislation that we still hold true today in terms of trial by peers, which we still see today in terms of jury trials, and also the right to be tried according to the law and not arbitrary processes and things, which again still holds true to this day, that you have to be accountable to the existing laws. So we see Magna Carta arriving, kind of tangential really to criminal law enforcement, I guess, other than those specific clauses of it. 1285 is really the kind of seminal date that I guess police historians look at, and the Statute of Winchester. And the Statute of Winchester becomes the basis of what we now understand of policing by consent, and this idea that everybody is collectively responsible for the policing of the country and the policing of their areas, and still kind of holds true today with what we understand as one of the so-called Peelian principles introduced by Sir Robert Peel with the foundation of the Metropolitan Police, that the police are merely people being paid full-time to do the duties incumbent on every citizen. And the Statute of Winchester introduces this idea of collective responsibility, that everybody in the hundreds, or the parishes as they're slowly becoming by that point, is responsible for the community and the safety and security of everybody else within that parish. And we see the idea of the hue and cry coming up, this idea that if somebody is seen to be responsible for committing a crime, it's the responsibility of everybody else in that community to raise this hue and cry, sort of shouting and chasing this offender, and assisting the constables, and assisting the parish constables, sorry, should I say at this point, the local law enforcers in detaining that person and bringing them to justice. So 1285 is really this kind of seminal date of this idea of the foundation of policing by a local official or a local appointed person as we know it. And that is the system that then holds true for the next 400 years, from sort of 1285 right through to 1829, really, and the foundation of the Metropolitan Police. So yeah, that's kind of the foundation of law enforcement as we know it.
When you talked about in Saxon times and even in William the Conqueror's time and after, about it being maybe voluntary, what was in it for them? Was it, like, for example, people who used to collect customs used to rake off some for themselves, and that sort of gave them an incentive to do the job because it was an onerous job, because you're unpopular and so on. So were there similar incentives for law enforcement, people doing law enforcement, or not?
I'm sure there were. We can see records kind of later on as we get into the early modern period, just sort of predating the Civil War and things, of parish constables. They could certainly claim any expenses that they incurred in the line of their duty in terms of transporting prisoners, maintenance, feeding people that were in custody, etc. And I'm sure that those were no doubt inflated somewhat to account for it. But we actually see that the position of the parish constable was actually quite unwanted in a lot of instances because of these extra responsibilities. And because it was only the burgesses that could do it, they are sort of the merchant class, people that have other professions. And all the time that they're having to dedicate to maintenance of law and order and catching thieves, etc., is time that they can't spend doing their primary business. So we actually see in a lot of instances the introduction of what we now call the substitute system, where the burgesses would pay other people to act as the parish constables on their behalf. And so there's kind of almost a revisionist history approach around this, that actually these people represent the first professional police officers going right back to 1285 and onwards, that these are people who are paid to undertake the role of parish constable in lieu of the people that were supposed to be doing it, because it was cheaper. You could make more money doing your primary profession and paying somebody else a much lower fee to have this responsibility of criminal law enforcement than you would if you gave up your time to do that. So yeah, we see these people, and they would often serve, because the position of parish constable had to be re-elected on a yearly basis by the local parish councils, etc. But we see often these substitute constables serving for long periods of time, sort of 7 to 12 years wasn't uncommon, serving instead of the people that were supposed to be doing it. So they must have been good at their jobs. It must have been a position that carried some responsibility and and incentives to do it. So obviously they were being paid to do this job by the people that didn't want to do it, so they're getting money that way. But there must have been other perks, like you say, to it as well.
How extensive were the powers of the constable? Were they the ones responsible for raising the hue and cry and setting up the night watch and things like that, or?
Yeah, so I think we have to remember that the night watch would only really have existed in kind of larger urban centres. Villages and such wouldn't have had kind of any permanent kind of law enforcement capabilities. Only sort of larger towns, particularly like walled centres, would have had a night watch because they would have had a defined boundary, etc. But yeah, we can see that that these parish constables did have fairly extensive powers. They were obviously solely responsible for law and order, and this is before a time of rapid communications. So there could be no way that these parish constables could communicate with another large town, etc., to make quick decisions. So they actually had quite a lot of freedom in terms of how they dealt with offences. And you have to consider at this time that the cost of prosecutions, we take it for granted now that if somebody commits a crime against you, the state will take that prosecution on. But that wasn't the time. That wasn't the case up until the late Victorian era. If you were a victim of crime, you had to pay for that prosecution of the suspect. And obviously, if you lost that prosecution, you would have to bear those costs completely. Even if you won the prosecution, it was unlikely that the person stealing from you would be able to pay you back, because why are they stealing? Because they don't have any money in the first place. So it was an expensive business bringing prosecutions. And then not only that, but the parish constables would have to maintain that person in some kind of holding centre and sort of upkeep them, feed them, provide them with water, etc., until the local courts took place. And again, it wasn't like today where the magistrates' courts happen every day and sort of prison buses take people to the courts and to prisons and whatever. This was a time that courts only generally took place every few months, like every quarter, and they were called quarter sessions. And so these people would have to be maintained in the local lockup for like a fixed period of time until the constable could take them to the quarter sessions or the assizes courts, which were even more rare. And so there was much more of a focus on kind of what we would now term, I guess, restorative justice. But in those days, it was very much based on shame. This is the time of local communities. Everybody knows each other. Your reputation is who you are. And so the justice was very much based on shame. And we're all familiar with the ideas of stocks and pillory. So stocks, by the way, is putting your legs through something on the ground, and pillory is putting your head and shoulders up through something at sort of head height. So that's the difference between stocks and pillory. We see that obviously being used as a form of kind of restorative justice. So offenders would be put in the stocks or the pillory for a certain period of time, and everybody would come and throw rotten fruit and vegetables at them. there were plenty of other imaginative and constructive punishments as well, as I'm sure your listeners are very familiar with already. But people could be subject to what was called rough music. So this was being kind of hounded through the streets. You'd either be stripped naked or to very little clothing. This was often if you'd were what was called cuckolded by your partner. So a female partner cheated on you. You would be sort of hounded through the streets naked while people made all sorts of clanging and bashing noises and stuff, and people would jeer at you and things like that. Other punishments were obviously the ducking or cucking stool. And it was actually a legal requirement for every village to have a cucking stool where offenders could be dunked underwater and held underwater for certain periods of time. And interestingly, there's records in many parishes that it was the responsibility of the parish constable to pay the fine to national government because they didn't have a ducking stool. So this constable was responsible for paying the fine for not upholding the law, because it was cheaper to do that than maintain this unwieldy contraption of a ducking stool. So it was much more community punishment based, and the constables would be responsible for organising that, determining the level of punishment and everything, rather than often putting offenders before the court. So they had quite a lot of powers on a very local level in that sense.
You mentioned the hue and cry earlier. How does that relate to the Act of 1285, or was that already happening? Is the hue and cry something that is sort of officially started up, or did it just evolve in over the centuries?
I think there was always a sense of collective responsibility in the community in terms of, if somebody in your community committed some kind of trespass against a person or property or whatever crime, then I think everybody kind of wanted to bring that person to justice, because you didn't want somebody like that living in your community. So they would literally be hounded out. But yeah, it's the Statute of Winchester in 1285 that really kind of formalizes that and makes it everybody's responsibility to catch these offenders and bring them to justice. And you would think, before an age of speedy communication and stuff, that somebody could just flee the village and go to a village a couple of towns down or whatever. But we have to remember that people were really wary of strangers at this time, because nobody really moved around unless it was a woman being sent to marry somebody else in the next town, etc. And there was general suspicion of vagrants, particularly, and it was one of the key duties, in fact, of the parish constable to keep an eye on vagrants and move them on, and kind of question them and see why they'd arrived in town. And they would be a real focus of kind of what we would now say, I guess, nosy neighbours, keeping an eye out on them, and the parish constable trying to move them on, because if they were homeless or destitute, etc., they became the responsibility of the parish to maintain them financially. So the parish constable would try and move them on. So yeah, the hue and cry would kind of chase this person out or capture them. And it was very successful, because obviously people didn't really have anywhere else to go. So they'd be brought back for justice, and then obviously they'd either be shamed in their own community, as we talked about, or they'd have to set up somewhere else, but again with that inherent mistrust and suspicion on them.
I guess that for the constable, that he knew people in his local village anyway, so he knew that, Fred Bloggs was likely to beat his wife, and so was a bit of a pilferer. But a stranger he knew nothing about. He didn't know what that person was capable of, what they might do, and the same for the community. So suspicion, I guess, was quite reasonable, really.
Absolutely, yeah, and that's why we see the parish constable system working for as long as it does, because communities know each other. Everybody knows each other, and even that's why we see the Metropolitan Police Act being introduced in 1829, because it was the ultimate breakdown by that point of the existing law enforcement structures, as these huge urban centres like London, and with the Industrial Revolution, sort of Manchester, Birmingham, Liverpool, Nottingham, etc., coming to the fore, and thousands of people moving in. The existing parish constables who didn't know people couldn't operate anymore. But as you say, everybody knew each other. If Sharon was the local ne'er-do-well, then the parish constable would know that, and he'd try and hound her out.
Very likely, I should think.
Yeah, exactly.
So you've mentioned Magna Carta, and it's having written Ladies of Magna Carta and done a little bit about Nicola de la Haye. It's the clauses 39 and 40, isn't it? Magna Carta. There's actually I've called them the foundations of our criminal justice system, because they were the ones, they're actually still in law today. They're two of only 4 clauses that are still in the law today. And well, they didn't set up the system of trial by jury, but they guarantee trial by jury and the right to justice without, basically, it says the law is not for sale. So how much of modern policing comes from the medieval period? Can you draw a line between, say, Magna Carta and 1829, or is it a wavy line, or just little chunks here and there?
I think the wavy line is a very good description. Yeah, I mean, as with everything in history, there is absolutely no chance of a direct line. You can't say this was always going to be the case. It's not this sort of ultimate end goal, and I think we'd all agree that policing today still isn't perfect. But yeah, absolutely, we see this gradual build up, and I think that's why British policing and law enforcement structures generally are still a little bit haphazard. And we have British policing is kind of hailed internationally as one of the best examples of policing in the world because of the history of where it comes from. This idea that everybody in a community is responsible for their safety, and the kind of this idea of what we would now say like neighborhood watch or Facebook spotted groups kind of thing, and everybody's keeping an eye out for each other. We date that back to right back to Anglo-Saxon times, as we've heard, and yeah, we see key legislation like Magna Carta still being reflected today by the right to trial by a jury of your peers. The Statute of Winchester is still reflected in terms of what's law enforcement today still upholds as his guiding principles of Sir Robert Peel, and those are drawn largely from that kind of Statute of Winchester. And we see the gradual development of it, like you say, through this really wavy path. Parish constables obviously provide that continuity and that role, but even then, their kind of efficacy is questioned throughout various points in history. So we can go to the early modern period, and we look at Shakespeare, and he's got probably one of the most famous depictions of a parish constable in Much Ado About Nothing, and we see Shakespeare's Dogberry as this kind of real slapstick comic relief in Much Ado About Nothing, where he's absolutely incompetent in his role of catching these baddies, and he's almost like presented as a drunkard, completely incompetent, hapless fool. And I think that's the idea that has stuck with us right through to today. And we also see a chap called John Earl, who writes about, he's almost the Chaucer of his time. He's writing about loads of different professions and what they do and his perceptions of them. And in 1628, he writes about the role of parish constables, and he describes them as a viceroy in the street who sits in their chair of state, willing to arrest the drunkard for not standing in the king's name. But I think we need to take these depictions as almost the equivalent of Punch magazine or Private Eye, as we see today, and kind of satire of these roles, because actually we can also then look at Oliver Cromwell, particularly when he took the role of Lord Protector. He came in and he specifically said he envisaged his role of Lord Protector as being akin to that of a good constable set to keep the peace of the parish. Now, if we're seeing parish constables as these kind of Dogberry characters who are willing to arrest drunk people for refusing to stand up in the king's name, then why would Oliver Cromwell, who's taken and fought hard for this ultimate power position, saying that he sees himself as a parish constable? He is trying to identify himself as William the Conqueror did in 1066 with existing community structures. He wants to be seen as this kind of community figure there to work with you. He's part of the community. He's not separate from the community. He's not the king. He's part of the community, and he wants to kind of maintain this peace. So the parish constable must have been a fairly respectable position. But as we weave through history, we obviously get these critiques that we've spoken about. We then see the introduction of modern policing as we know it, but that's within urban centres. We still see as late as sign of the 1870s with local communities are still fighting to keep their parish constables in the face of the introduction of a sort of more centralised county law enforcement and police officers. So they must have been these really valuable members of the community, and we still base our community policing ethos today on that structure, that everybody wants a local bobby who they can identify with, who knows the local people in the area, and we can trace that right back to these Anglo-Saxon times, and the idea that the parish constable was that member of the local community.
I guess that the quality, in a sense, of the local constable depends, like many things, on the quality of the man who's doing it and how he sees his job, whether he regards it as being important and he has a sense of responsibility, or whether he is going through the motions. I guess there's as many different types of parish constable as there are people.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. And we, as we've kind of discussed already, this idea that they were all very kind of independent people, and they would make decisions based obviously on potentially their best interests. So they are. We still have to remember that they are from the local elite. How that we're not talking the barons and the earls and everything. We're talking about the local sort of more affluent people in the community.
Mm.
But we're still talking about the imposition of law and order by those above, kind of on those below. And even with the substitute constables, who are the ones that are being paid to do the job, they're still accountable to the person that's paying them, aren't they? If the
Yeah.
person that's paying them is committing a crime and they're not paying their workers, or they're doing whatever, the person they're paying isn't then going to arrest them and put them in front of the local court, are they? Because you don't
No.
bite the hand that feeds.
No, quite.
So yeah, we're still talking about the imposition of law and order by the elites on the have-nots. So yeah, it's a very complicated system, and obviously they're still accountable. Then you've got these layers of law enforcement, this local law enforcement, then accountable to the sheriff, who's kind of then accountable to the king. But then you've got these different kind of administrations that the judges stand separate from the constables, and later on separate from the king, but perhaps not at this time. And the jury of the peers is also equally debatable. How much on a level of your peers is the local gentry compared to like the sort of village, the working class folks in the village and stuff.
And of course, for women, a jury of your peers is all men. Is it, or did they have women in the jury?
Exactly. Yes. Yeah. No, they wouldn't have had women in the jury. Juries were again made up of the local burgesses, and I mean, even when you get to sort of the assizes courts in front of a judge, then yes, there is a jury there, but those juries were very much directed by the judge. And actually, there's cases in law of if juries have found somebody not guilty, judges have actually thrown them in prison because they've said no, this person is clearly guilty and you've reached the wrong decision, so you are in contempt of court, and the judges have thrown the jury in prison. So we look at this right to trial by jury, and we think this is this vaunted principle that's come with Magna Carta, but it's not. And obviously the judges are accountable to the king, and there's various levels of courts right up to kind of the Star Chamber, which is basically the King's Council. And obviously if the king wants you found guilty, then you're going to be found guilty, kind of thing. So yeah, it's a very complicated melange, I guess, of different levels of accountability, and who's actually going to be sent before the court versus who's going to be whipped or pilloried and things in the local community.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about the punishment, because clearly it wasn't possible for every village constable to have a secure place to lock somebody up, was it? They didn't all have jails, did they?
They didn't have jails, but we can actually see still surviving to this day instances of what were called local lockups, and these were, listeners may be more familiar with the idea of like dovecotes and things, basically buildings with no windows and just a door, etc. And it was actually a legal responsibility that every town, bearing in mind the delineator between a village and a town was whether you had your own parish constable. Every town had to maintain their own village lockup, which was where prisoners would be held until the courts were heard. And there's still countless surviving examples of this that people may walk past on a daily basis and have no idea about. And there is actually a website. If you search for My Local Lockup, there is a website that documents all the existing medieval lockups that that are still around, and you won't
Wow.
notice them as you walk past, because they're literally small kind of brick round houses or sort of square box buildings, but they still exist in sort of many, not so much the cities because they've been cleared away to make space, but particularly in villages, they're still surprisingly common, and you can see them to this day.
Were they purpose? But was that their sole purpose, or were they buildings that were used for other things when they weren't locking somebody up?
No, that was their sole purpose. They would have just literally been used to keep prisoners in until the constable could take them to the local courts. They would often share space with the local pinder. So you'd have the lockup building where the prisoners would be held, and then there'd be like a small like enclosure next to it where stray animals would be held, and that was the job of the pinder, to go and round up any stray animals that had wandered off the common pasture land, and then the farmers or villagers, whatever, would come and claim them back. So it's kind of a joint law enforcement structure, you could almost call it. But yeah, the sole purpose of the lockup was to maintain these prisoners until they were sent to court. And again, it was a legal requirement to have that in a town.
Did they use the lockup as a punishment in itself, or was it only really to hold them for further trial? Or do we not know?
I'd be sure they do. Yeah, no, I couldn't definitively answer, because in a lot of cases we can see in historical records that local parish council records would report that we had no crimes at all this year, and I think we can confidently say that would never have been the case. There's always going to be people stealing bread or attacking people, etc. But these parishes are reporting that we've had no crimes at all this year to report. But I would stake a large amount of money on the fact that there were minor occurrences happening, but obviously if they reported them to sort of regional and central government, etc., they would have then had to account for why these people didn't go to trial and things like that. So I'm sure that these lockups were used in this kind of summary justice sense, where it'd be like, well, you've clearly done this, you can have 3 days in the lockup as a result of it, and then be let out afterwards, in the same way that other imaginative and creative punishments would have been meted out.
Yeah, and I guess for drunks as well, it was a cooling off place, wasn't it?
Well, absolutely, yeah. But yeah, if you were excessively drunk, then yeah, absolutely, you would be locked up to cool off, kind of thing, and calm down. Yeah.
What about more serious crimes then? What was the punishment for? I'm assuming murder was automatic death, but manslaughter or causing someone serious injury,
Yeah.
did they have amputations and things? Because you always read about people having their hands cut off. And was it something that did happen?
I don't think punishments kind of, because to get to court, you would have had to have been a fairly affluent victim, and then likely some kind of fairly affluent offender. As we talked about, the sort of local authorities wouldn't necessarily have wasted the court's time, or not wasted the court's time, but taken up the court's time with sort of more trivial matters. So we also didn't see prisons really as a kind of common feature. So yes, absolutely, capital offences were common. That was pretty much the only sort of justice meted out to the common people for murder and kind of serious assaults like that. You would obviously be hanged for that, but only those who kind of affronted the king or other baronry, etc., would be sent to dungeons. And I'm not aware of kind of amputations and things taking place. It is much more these being put in the stocks, or being sort of dunked, or being put in the lockup, or gibbeted for a certain amount of time, or gibbeted obviously after execution. You also get other creative punishments like the scold's bridle, which was kind of a metal contraption that was put over your head and held your tongue down so that you couldn't talk and struggled to eat. So it's much more kind of this creative punishment rather than sort of physical punishment. Like, yes, William the Conqueror, when he came over, did reform the justice system and kind of favoured almost like an eye for an eye kind of thing. Like, you would have had an eye removed or a tongue, etc. But again, that was much more only for people committing these really serious crimes like murder that would have come to the attention of the courts. It wasn't the case on kind of a local basis, I wouldn't have thought.
I don't know whether you know anything about the sort of ordeal by fire and water and so on. Did those exist? Did that exist? Was it a real thing? Do you know?
I couldn't really speak to that. I don't think. I don't
No,
know.
I just suddenly popped into my head.
Yeah. I don't really know enough about that.
Yeah, it sort of sounds a bit apocryphal, really, but
Yeah, I'm
who
sure it did
knows?
exist. I mean, there are records of it that people trial by faith and whatever.
Mm.
I think we find a lot with those. I've noticed because one of the famous ones is Earl Godwin trial by cake, which was he said apparently he said to Edward the Confessor, "If I betrayed you, let me be killed by this piece of cake." And apparently he choked on it, had a stroke, and died. So
That's the best punishment I've ever heard.
But I think that's actually it's applied to it sort of thing. He had a stroke and died after the Easter feast with Edward the Confessor. So the cake and the "let this cake kill me" was attached to him afterwards as a form of, look, this is justice. This is God's justice. He did it, rather than he just keeled over. And it's just
I love that. Maybe we should reintroduce that
yeah,
now.
I'd go for trial by cake, honest. Yeah.
It sounds very much like Matilda, the film. I've got visions of Miss Trunchbull when she forces that guy to eat all the chocolate cake. The punishment.
But yeah, the chroniclers were never slow in taking advantage of an opportunity to give a lesson.
Yes, I'm quite sure that they weren't. Yeah.
But I guess an aspect that, we've talked a lot about the idea of collective responsibility of communities throughout the time, really. I guess with that kind of a system, it's very imperfect and it's very varied and variable in terms of the outcomes. So it's a great system in terms of getting something done, but it's a terrible system in terms of trying to get the same thing done in the same way.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. Yeah, there's absolutely no standardization at all. Now we're very hot on sort of national sentencing guidelines and stuff, and there's punishment durations and mitigation and aggravating factors, etc., that determine somebody's sentence length. But yeah, this collective responsibility, almost in a way, I think benefits the justice system because the community would have decided on a suitable punishment for an offender. So the community's need for justice would have been satiated in this kind of collective, well, we've all decided that this is what that person is deserving of. And I think that perhaps brings with it this sense of justice, really, that the community have decided what is an appropriate outcome for this person. And I think given that everybody knew each other, there's strong feelings of guilt if you sort of sentence your neighbor to excess harsh punishments, because then you've got to live next to them with whatever the consequences are. Or if your local blacksmith has committed a crime, you're not going to sentence them to death, are you? Because where are you going to get your horseshoes and stuff from? Or you're not going to amputate their right hand because they're not going to be able to work. And then they become the parish's responsibility to maintain them. So I think we have to kind of weigh that competing element up against each other of, yes, this person has trespassed against the law and we need to punish them, but actually they are an integral part of the community. This community is a functioning organism where everybody's got a role and we rely on everybody. We don't want to have to go and send to the next town for our accoutrements or whatever, and they're going to charge us more because they don't know us, or we're not going to necessarily be able to trade with them because they've already got everything that they need over there, so we can't sell them our additional wheat because they don't need it. So there's that constant weighing up and balancing of the different needs of the community, I would think, in determining that kind of punishment.
One thing I've just realised that I haven't asked, and I was thinking about the Sheriff of Nottingham earlier, outlawry. How often was somebody outlawed and made to go and live in the forest? Did it happen?
Yeah, absolutely. So again, this was much more of a punishment aimed at, I guess, more more serious crimes and those that went to court. And it was, or those, more specifically, those that didn't go to court. So it's more about those people that were summoned to attend court and failed to go. So they'd have been summoned to attend one of the various courts under the different kinds of legislation that existed at the time. So we had ecclesiastical courts that dealt with church matters, so non-attendance at church, failure to observe the Sabbath, things like that. We had forest courts that were responsible for if you were hunting on the king's forests or committing crimes in the king's forest, cutting trees down. And then we had common law for the sort of more traditional criminal matters that we would think of, such as murder and theft, etc. All had their own courts. And if you were summoned to attend one of those courts and you failed to appear, you would then have a warrant issued for you. So the local parish constable or the sheriff, if you were a bit more senior, would come and try and track you down. At that point, if they realised that you'd fled, you were then called an outlaw because you were outside the purview of the law. You were no longer entitled to the safety that the law afforded you in this kind of collective responsibility. Obviously, given what we've spoken about, it would have only generally been more affluent people that would have been subject to that, because the common folk wouldn't have been summoned to attend courts unless they were very unlucky and were caught like hunting in the forest. But it was very unusual for the kind of working classes to be summoned for offences like that. So it was much more the affluent folks who were the ones that were kind of declared outlaw. So we can determine from that, I guess, that Robin Hood and his band of merry men weren't your typical peasants, because they simply wouldn't have been summoned to court. They'd have been dealt with by the local parish constable, or they were in a larger sort of urban centre, somewhere like Nottingham or Retford or Mansfield or somewhere in South Yorkshire, perhaps, and kind of fall under the purview of the town justices, because it was much different in towns in terms of people were taken to court in towns because that's where the courts were, I think. So it was a lot easier.
Well, thank you, Tom, for an absolutely fascinating discussion. I know a heck of a lot more than my history teacher ever taught me. Well, all we ever did was the hue and cry. And I still remember doing it as, the hue and cry. We did a whole episode, a whole lesson on it. And so I've always got this image of people with pitchforks and a torch chasing people, which is more or less Salem witch trials as well, isn't it?
Yeah, or Beauty and the Beast, whichever.
So everybody had the same kind of lesson for the hue and cry for Beauty and the Beast and that,
Yes, yeah, I think so. Yeah,
probably. Yeah.
I mean, it would have been like that. That was what the hue and cry was. Everybody would have chased this offender down, and summoned the people from neighbouring villages if the chase went on further and things. And yeah, that all came out from this kind of medieval era of this collective responsibility, and you don't want a thief living in your midst, so we need to catch them.
Now, you have got a podcast coming out soon, haven't you? When does that start? Do you know yet?
Hopefully by the end of April or May. Obviously, you know about this because you are one of my guests. A bit of reciprocity there. But yes, I will be launching East Midlands Chronicles very soon, which is a podcast exploring the history of the illustrious East Midlands, and however you want to define that, be that on today's kind of definition of Northamptonshire, Lincolnshire, Nottinghamshire, Derbyshire, or whether you want to define it by various kind of medieval boundaries of Sherwood Forest pushing up into South Yorkshire and things. But yeah, so it's going to cover more esoteric histories of the East Midlands region. But yeah, that should be out on all kind of podcast platforms, hopefully by the end of May at the very latest.
Well, thank you very much for joining us, Tom. It's been absolutely fascinating, and good luck with the podcast.
Excellent.
Thank you very much. I've really enjoyed it. Thank you both.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks.
Do join us next time when, I suppose, a slight extension of this topic. We are joined by Annie Whitehead talking about murder in Anglo-Saxon England, which should be quite interesting. I'm looking forward to that.
I can't wait.
I've been Sharon Bennett Connolly.
And I'm Derek Birks. Thanks for listening. Don't forget, you can find the podcasts on YouTube as well as all your favourite podcast providers. And if you have a minute, it would be great if you could give us a like or a review. Thanks again.